They buried him at his home in Ramah. Then David moved down to the desert of Paran. A certain man in Maon, who had property there at Carmel, was very wealthy. He had 1,000 goats and 3,000 sheep, which he was shearing in Carmel. His name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. She was an intelligent and beautiful woman, but her husband was surly and mean in his dealings, and he was a Calebite. While David was in the wilderness, he heard that Nabal was shearing sheep. So he sent 10 young men and said to them, "Go up to Nabal in Carmel and greet him in my name. Say to him, 'Long life to you, good health to you and your household, and good health to all that is yours.' Now hear that it is sheep shearing time. When your shepherds were with us, we did not mistreat them, and the whole time they were at Carmel, nothing of theirs was missing. Ask your own servants, and they will tell you. Therefore be favorable toward my men, since we come at a festive time. Please give your servants and your son David wherever you can find for them." When David's men arrived, they gave Nabal this message in David's name. Then they waited. Nabal answered David's servants, "Who is this David? Who is the son of Jesse? Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. Why should they take my bread and water, and the meat I have slaughtered for my shearers, and give it to men claiming to come from whom they were?" David's men turned around and went back. When they arrived, they reported every word. David said to these men, "Each of you strap on your sword." So they did, and David strapped on as well. About 400 men went up with David, while 200 stayed with supplies. Well, one of the servants told Abigail, Nabal's wife, "David sent messengers to the wilderness to give our master his greetings." But he hurled insults at them. Yet these men were very good to us. They did not mistreat us, and the whole time we were out in the fields near them, nothing was missing. Night and day, there is a wall around us the whole time, and we are herding our sheep near them. Now think it over and see what you can do, because this disaster is hanging over our master and his whole household. He is such a wicked man that no one can talk to him. Abigail acted quickly. She took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep, 5 seahs of roasted grain, 100 cakes of raisins, and 200 cakes of pressed figs, and loaded them on donkeys. Then she told her servants, "Go on ahead, I'll follow you." But she did not tell her husband Nabal. As she came riding her donkey into a mountain ravine, there was David and his men descending toward her as she met them. David had just said, "It's been useless, all my watching over this fellow's property in the wilderness, so that nothing of his was missing. He paid me back evil for good. May God deal with David, be it ever so severely by morning, if I leave alive one male of who belongs to him." When Abigail saw David, she quickly got off her donkey and bowed down before David with her face to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, "Pardon your servant, my lord, and let me speak to you. Hear what your servant has to say." "Please pay no attention, my lord, to that wicked man Nabal. He is just like his name, for his name means fool, and folly goes with him. And as for me, your servant, I did not see the men my lord sent. And now, my lord, as surely as the Lord your God lives, and as you live, since the Lord has kept you from bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hands, may your enemies and all who are intent on harming my lord be like Nabal. And let this gift, which your servant has brought to you, my lord, be given to the men who follow you. Please forgive your servant's presumption. The Lord your God will certainly make a lasting dynasty for my lord. Because you fight with the Lord's battles, no wrongdoing will be found in you as long as you live. Even though someone is pursuing you to take your life, the life of my Lord will be bound securely in the bundle of the living Bible of the Lord your God, but the lives of your enemies he will hurl away from the pocket of a slave. When the Lord has fulfilled for my Lord every good thing that promised concerning him and has appointed him ruler over Israel, my Lord will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed, or of having avenged himself. And the Lord your God has brought my Lord success, remembering your servant." David said to Abigail, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you today to meet me. May you be blessed for your good judgment, and for keeping me bloodshed this day, and for avenging myself with my own hands." Otherwise, as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, who has kept me from harming you, if you had not come quickly to meet me, not one male belonging to Nabal would have been left alive by daybreak." Then David accepted from her hand which she had brought to him and said, "Go home in peace. I have heard your words and granted your request." When Abigail went to Nabal, he was in the house holding a banquet like that of a king. He was in high spirits and very drunk. So she told him nothing at all until daybreak. Then in the morning, when Nabal was sober, his wife told him all these things, and his heart failed him, and he became like a stone. About 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. When David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, "Praise be to the Lord, who has upheld my cause against Nabal for treating me with contempt. He has brought his servant from doing wrong, and has brought Nabal's wrongdoing down on his own head." Then David sent word to Abigail, asking him to become his wife. His servants went to Carmel and said to Abigail, "David has sent us to you, and he is to take you to become his wife." He bowed down with her face to the ground as she said, "I am your servant, and am ready to serve you and wash the feet of my Lord's servants." Abigail quickly got a donkey, attended by 5 female servants, went with David's messengers and became his wife. David also married Ahinoam of Jezreel, and they both were his wives. But Saul had given his daughter Michal, David's wife, to Palental, son of Lachish, who was from Galilee.
Thank you, Richard. As I contemplate and have throughout the summer series some of the stories of the Old Testament and some forgotten folks from the Old Testament, I couldn't help but contemplate that the first couple of messages that we heard, be Cain and Abel or Esau and Jacob, dealt with parenting, right? We talked about parenting lessons that could be found in those passages of Scripture. And we get to this particular story, and to me, this is more about marriage than it is about parenting. And I always marvel at how practical the lessons are that we find within God's Word on any given Sunday or on any given day when we pick up our Bibles. And so I entitled this "The Better Half." Really, I guess what that came from is maybe you've heard of the phrase or even been asked, men, from time to time, "Where's your better half?" Anybody been asked that before? Where's your better half? As for me, I hear it all the time. I initially thought they were referring to my split personality. But I came to realize that what they were really talking about was my beautiful wife, right? Now, sometimes they're just joking around, right? But sometimes I'm not so sure. And oftentimes, if not always, I'm inclined to agree. When we stood before God 36 years ago and made a covenant to spend the rest of our lives together, God performed a miracle that day, as He does when two believers come together. He takes two and makes them one. Using a math formula that only works for God, He said 1 + 1 = 1, right? And that's amazing stuff. So Denise and I are now one. And if I contemplate that, I clearly have to come to the agreement that she's the better half, right? I mean, setting aside her HGTV-worthy remodeling skills, her beauty, her insight, her wonderful sense of humor, the fact of the matter is that she saved me from myself over and over again in those 36 years. For instance, I don't know if I've ever said this before, I credit God fully with me being here at First Baptist Church, Monroeville, with an assist to Peter and Jim Seymour. But the reality is, I did not even want to respond to the letter you sent me when you requested me to consider coming here. It was Denise who persuaded me to follow through and to return the call to you. It was her. Of course, she regrets it now, but just kidding. Denise, who early in our marriage convinced me to give up drinking alcohol. It was Denise who convinced me to attend seminary. And if it weren't for Denise, I'd probably buy a new car about every 2 years. She is the person who is my guide. I mean, God is my pilot. But there is nobody I trust in my life more than my better half. Fact of the matter is this: every husband needs a better half. Let's pray. Father, as we reflect upon your word this day, I pray for wisdom, that my words would be your words. I pray, Lord God, that you would open our hearts and minds to what we need to hear personally today. And that through the power of your Holy Spirit, we might apply it to our lives. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Today's scripture involves three key players, right? Three key players: David, Nabal, and of course his better half, Abigail. Nabal, whose name, and we find this in scripture, literally means fool. Clearly, he's the antagonist here in this story. There's no way of getting around that. David, he's still on the run from King Saul at the time this story takes place. But in the meantime, he has garnered quite a following. We read of 600 men. Of course, we've read of his 400 fighting men before. These men are now under his leadership. And what they would do is they would patrol this dangerous land of Paran. I mean, we are talking here the middle of nowhere. Okay, this is no man's land. And any flocks that would be in this area, any herds that were grazing, were a great risk. First of all, from wild animals, but also from thieves. So David and his men basically provided protection. That's what they did, to these flocks of anyone who was in the area, and that happened to include Nabal. I know it sort of sounds like the mafia, but it wasn't. It wasn't like that at all. There was no formal agreement. Matter of fact, peacemakers like David would not demand payment for their service. It was just sort of understood that the owners of the flocks would voluntarily give some sort of payment out of gratitude for the service that they were providing. I mean, a good analogy might be when you and I go to a restaurant and have a meal, and our waitress provides us with the service. If that service is okay, we might give a modest tip of sorts. If the service is excellent, we're probably going to give a generous tip. That's how it usually works, right? That's how it works. To give a small tip or no tip at all to someone who's provided excellent service, that would be a slap in the face to that person. Long story short, David and his men had provided excellent service to Nabal. And Nabal knew it. He knew this, yet there is no compensation. Nothing is given. And it is at this point that David enters the picture. Not personally, he sends his men to meet with Nabal at sheep shearing time. Sends 10 of his men, and they approach Nabal about the situation at hand. They address just as David instructs them to. They greet him saying, have a long life, peace be with you, and peace be with your house, and peace be with all that you have. Then they basically go on to reiterate the wonderful service that they have provided. And then they simply say, please give your servants and your son David whatever you can find for them. You see, they are tactful. They don't go barging through the doors demanding some sort of payment, nor did they even demand a specific amount of payment here. No, come to think of it, as I was commenting, this would be sort of like if I received a bill from Duquesne Light, which I do, by the way, every month. If that bill were to say, blessings be upon your home and your family. Our records indicate that we have provided good service for you over the past 30 days. Now, because we have expenses of our own to pay, we thought maybe you could help us out. We have provided a self-addressed, postage paid envelope. Please send whatever you can spare. Signed, your humble servants at Duquesne Light. Sort of like what it would be, right? I mean, like that's going to happen. Point is, David's approach is both humble and fair. His approach it involves the opportunity to resolve the situation at a price that he deems to be fair. Yet the fool basically rejects it. Matter of fact, not only does he reject the words of David's men when they come, he adds insult to injury by saying, who is David and who is the son of Jesse? And in doing so, he is now disrespecting David's family. He knew exactly who David was and what he was providing and where his family came from. He knew this. The fact of the matter is he was insulting David's family. David did not come from high pedigree. Unlike Nabal, who came from the line of Caleb, if you will. You know, from the Joshua Caleb fame. That's the line that he came from. And he's basically saying this, David, you're nobody. You're nobody. You come from nothing. Who are you to even talk to me, let alone ask me for payment? Besides, I have my own people that I need to compensate. I can't take away from them. Basically, he says, forget it. Right? He insults him, refuses to pay, and says, forget it. In short. So David's men, they don't make a big scene out of the whole situation. They quietly leave. And they go back to David and they report exactly what has transpired. Now David, in not one of his finer moments, responds with this knee-jerk reaction and immediately issues orders for 400 of his men to gird their swords. Okay, suit up for battle, right? He's not going to get away with this, is basically what he's saying. This fool is not going to get away with it. Everything he has, including himself, is going to be destroyed. That's what David's plan is. It'll be a massacre. And it's a great story, isn't it? Really, it's a good story. With murder on his mind, David and his troops set off. They set off for the shearing festival in Carmel. As I said, not one of his finer moments, if you will. Meantime, I might say that we rarely receive good results when we act rashly. And that's what David is doing here. Maybe you've done that before, responded in a knee-jerk reaction. And in those moments, it usually doesn't turn out well. In those moments when emotions are running wild, you and I, we need to pause and reflect, right? We need to reflect and pray for God's wisdom. Matter of fact, we ought to be praying that God's grace becomes part of our response as we confront whoever it is that's involved in the situation. But that's not what goes on here. That's not what David does. And with this, we are introduced to Abigail, right? The better half, if you will. Whose name, by the way, means my father is joy. Now, she's both intelligent, Abigail is, as well as beautiful. It seems as if somebody overheard the situation as it transpired between David's men and Nabal, and they overhear it, and they report back to Abigail exactly what happened. He says David's men were good to us. And Nabal's response was rude. He also warns that evil is now being plotted by David against the entire household, he says. And that's what's going on. The servant basically now puts Nabal at Abigail's court, saying that Nabal is worthless. He is a man that nobody can talk to. You, Abigail, the better half, you need to consider what to do in this situation to avoid calamity. Jennifer indicated that the most likely of people who give David advice as one who recognizes his better half, I'm not sure it's the most unlikely of people. But maybe in today's world as well as back then, it would have been considered as such. Sadly, the ball's in her court, and she is industrious, and Abigail is ingenious. And so immediately she devises a plan, and that plan is to put together a meal big enough for an army. You know, something like what Marva Seymour would do. I mean, seriously, that's the first person I thought of when I heard about that plan. I said, now that's a plan that Marva could buy into. She literally puts together a meal big enough for an army in an effort to save her husband's neck, mind you, as well as protect her whole household. Now, this is a climax of the story. Really, it is. We are reaching the climax. You got two men who are about as different as any two men could be, yet they are behaving very similarly at this point in time, right? Both men are allowing their anger to rule the day. Both men have said nasty things about the other. Both men act rational. And therefore, basically eliminate the possibility of common sense prevailing. And that happens with men all the time, right, women? Yeah. Common sense oftentimes doesn't prevail. Yes, this is the climax of our story as Abigail enters the inn. So we might ask first and foremost, who does she approach, right? You might think she would approach her husband. That's the person she has a relationship with. However, we've already been told that he won't listen to anybody, including his own wife. And so instead she approaches David. You might say, well, how is she going to approach him? Well, she bows down before him. She reinforces how worthless a man her husband is, because frankly, he is. But ultimately, she appeals to David's common sense. That's her plan. She appeals to his common sense. And in essence, she says, David, you need to look beyond this episode. What is going to transpire if you follow through with this plan? You're not even 30 years old yet. In your situation, you can afford to return good for evil. You really can. I mean, after all, you are God's choice to be the next king of Israel. However, if you take matters into your own hands, if you follow through with your plan, your reputation is going to take a hit here. It really is. It's going to take a hit. You need to let go. You need to let God handle the situation, right? How many times have I, in the aftermath of a bad decision, said, I should have let go. I should have let God. I just should have, right? David had been blinded by his ego. That's the bottom line. He had been guided by his emotions. But after hearing Abigail's appeal, he realized just how foolish he was acting. And he praises her. He praises her for her wisdom. And he thanks his God for sending her to him, preventing this massacre that was clearly going to happen. It was clearly David's plan. So that in the end, although these two men may have been acting very similarly, there was one major difference between the two men. One would not listen to anyone, the fool, whereas David was willing to listen to Abigail. You might ask the question, why? Well, because one of those famous words that describe David, he was a man after God's own heart. David made mistakes, made lots of them, as we all do as human beings. But he always had a desire. His desire was that his heart would reflect God's heart. That he would respond the way God wanted him to. Didn't always happen. It's recorded in Scripture. Didn't always happen. He messed up many a time. But that was his desire, that he would do what God wanted him to do. So that David accepts Abigail's gift, the food, the meal. Not as good as Marcus, but it was a good meal. He accepts the gift. But more importantly, he rethinks his plans. Because of her wise words. Because of her counsel. There is a catastrophe that is avoided here because of her counsel. Yes, Nabal, the fool, lives on for now. And David's reputation, it remains intact. All because of the wisdom of the better half of Abigail. As for the rest of the story, well, of course, David left justice ultimately in God's hands, and after Abigail informed Nabal as to what had transpired, we are told that his heart, which was already hardening, became like a stone, and that 10 days later he was dead. In the end, God's justice prevails. In the end, God's justice always prevails. People sometimes look around at wealthy people, at powerful people, at well-known people, the rich and famous, and they'll say, by all appearances, these people are evil. And they think there must be no justice. Well, guess what? In God's time and in God's way, there is always justice. It always takes place. They will pay a price. They will pay a price for their evil ways, as was the case in our story. If not in this world, then in eternity. That's God's promise. He is a just God. Period. The fool never wins in the end. As for Abigail, we do get our fairy tale ending, right? We get our fairy tale ending. David recognizes not just her beauty and not just her wisdom, but also that she is a widow in need. So it's far deeper than just the things you might look at otherwise. She is now a widow. She needs taken care of. And with this in mind, he takes her as his wife. So what an ending, right? Really, they ought to make a movie out of this. It's a wonderful story. But in the end, we have to ask, what do we learn from this wonderful story, right? Always tip your waitress? The wife is always right?
Yes.
Well, not quite, but we'll get to that. Let's look at what we learned from our characters. From David. What do we learn from David? We've already sort of alluded to this subject. First and foremost, we ought not to respond in knee-jerk reactions. We ought not to act rashly. Rarely, if ever, does that end well. I mean, think about what would have David's murdering Nabal done for his reputation as king when he ascended to the throne. When you and I, when we're confronted with these types of passionate reactions, we really need to hit the pause button. I mean, that's what we need to do. We need to sleep on it, if you will. And while doing so, we should also take time to at least try to understand the other person's point of view. We ought to at least try to do that, right? I mean, and that's not always easy. It involves humility. It involves the acknowledgement that just maybe I'm wrong, right? But we ought to at least try to understand what their perspective is, what their point of view is. But we also ought to, as we pause, attempt to consider what are the potential consequences if I follow through and do what I'm thinking I'm going to do. What are the long-range ramifications to my reputation, to my ability to share the love of Jesus with other people around me? What are the ramifications if I do this thing rashly, passionately? What's going to happen? What will people think of me? Well, always consider that as we pause. And that's something that clearly David didn't do. He didn't, at least until Abigail entered the picture. He had not done that, which involves another potential avenue we ought to look at when we are in these types of situations. We ought to garner and gather the counsel of wise people around us. We really ought to. We ought to invite them to share their thoughts, their opinions, and we ought to actually listen. Listen. Because oftentimes they'll share the common sense that we're missing in the entire situation. Seek wise counsel of others. I'm telling you, flying off the handle with virtually no sense of or need for, if you will, self-control, it rarely ends good. What about David? What can you learn from David? Besides, don't be a fool. Well, don't be a fool. Well, for starters, I think one of the things we learned, and I said earlier that this sort of, to me, is a lesson on marriage as well. We learn as couples, when we as husbands, and yes, as wives, are insensitive to our mates, it almost always ends in heartache. When we are insensitive to one another as husband and wife, it almost always ends in heartache. As wives, when you routinely criticize your husband, when you show no admiration for him, no respect for him, you invite heartache. I'm just telling you. I equate this to much of my counseling to young couples. I'll advise a young couple, in particular the husband, that they really ought to love their wives the way Jesus loved his wife, his bride, the church, you and I. Isn't that what Paul writes to us in Ephesians 5? We are to love our brides as Christ loved his bride. Which raises a question that I always pose to young men: how did Jesus love his bride? Well, he always wanted what was best for us. Always. Everything he did was about us. He always placed our needs ahead of his own needs. He was willing to sacrifice anything and everything, including a throne in heaven and a life on earth, for the sake of us, his bride. I tell young men, that's the way you ought to treat your wives. That's what the Bible tells us. But then I tell the young lady, if he treats you that way, and you don't show him the admiration and respect, what do you think is going to happen? Well, he's going to stop treating you that way, right? It's a vicious cycle. So that when you, as a wife, do not respect, do not honor, do not show admiration to your husband, you are inviting heartache, because he's not going to treat you the way that you want to be treated. But then there's a flip side of the coin, right? Then there is husbands treating their wives. We need to be sensitive, husbands, to the needs of our wives. And part of that becomes understanding that communication to a woman is what intimacy is to a man. When you dismiss her when she is talking to you, anybody men, ever been guilty of that? Yeah, be honest. When you dismiss her, you are demoralizing her just as much as when she rejects you physically. You are demoralized. You need to be sensitive to this. I was listening just the other night to a broadcast on Focus on the Family, in which they were dealing with this exact topic. And there was an author of a book, his name is David Clark. The book he wrote was Can We Talk? And he deals with this very issue. And he gives several steps that men probably ought to keep in mind when they're talking to us. Mind you, he refers to men as clams, and women as crowbars, trying to pry open the clam, right? I think it'd make for good reading. I haven't read the book, but I heard the interview. In any event, he gives several steps that we as men ought to keep in mind when we are trying to have a conversation, or our wives actually are trying to have a conversation with us. For instance, you are to give her your complete attention, right? Now that seems like common sense until she's sitting there talking to you and you're checking your emails on your cell phone, right? Men, any of you guilty of that? Again, I'm guilty. I like to think I can multitask, and I'm pretty good at it. I really believe I am, but that's not the point. What is the message? When I'm on my phone, checking my message, what message am I sending to my wife as she's trying to have a conversation with me? I'm saying you're not important enough to have my undivided attention. You need to give her your undivided attention. You need to make eye contact with her when she is talking to you. These are important. These are really important. You need to respond to what she's saying. Okay? Don't just sit there silently unless you want her to go on and on and on and talk forever. Which wives are apt to do when you don't engage in the conversation. Men, we're guilty of these things far too often. we are guilty of. You need to share with her. She wants to know what's going on in your life. That's important to her. She doesn't just want to share with you what's going on in her life and have you respond. She wants you to share what's going on in your life. And that involves more than walking through the door and her saying, how was your day? And you saying, okay. She deserves more than 2 letters, okay? Okay? Right. I mean, these are things that we need to learn as mates, as husbands, as wives, as we contemplate. You know, why maybe things are a little dry, a little off in our marriages. How are we doing in these areas? The reality is when we are insensitive, and we see this in our lesson today, to our mates, heartache follows. To me, that's a very significant lesson in this passage of Scripture. But let's look at Abigail. What do we learn from Abigail? Well, at some level, I think we learn that timing is everything, right? Perfect timing in approaching David. Perfect timing, right? But even more so, maybe perfect timing as to how she approaches her husband. Because let's face it, she comes home from her encounter with David and finds that Party Central is going on in the house. Finds that he is in a drunken stupor. And she says, not a good time to talk to him. Because timing is everything. She instead waits until the next day. I would tell you as husband and wives, or as friends, or fellow workers, timing is everything. When you have a passionate, potential conflicting conversation to have with somebody, you need to really contemplate what is the best time to have that conversation. When is it best? Is it best to have it in public? Is it best to have it in private? As a husband and wife, is the best time to have a potential explosive conversation as you're about to turn off the lights at night, when you're both exhausted and nobody's really able to talk? No. You need to think about these things. Timing is everything. Contemplate what I want to say, how I want to say it, but ultimately when I want to say it. The reality is, when those conversations take place, we need to listen. We need to listen to hear and to understand. Far too often we listen to respond. And we are formulating a response in our head while they're still talking, instead of trying to say, okay, I really want to understand what you're saying here. There are wonderful lessons. Isn't that the wonderful thing about God's Word? Every story has a lesson. It would make a wonderful movie. It is a great plot. It has a fairy tale ending, but if we fail to learn anything along the way, it's nothing more than a good story. There's so much more. I hope you were blessed by hearing this message today. Let's pray. Father, as we reflect upon the lessons in your word, we thank you. So far too often we just set them aside as good stories. But Lord, you have given them to us that we might reflect upon them, that we might learn from them, and we might draw nearer to you through them. Lord, in the marriages represented here today, I pray that these lessons on marriage will be applied to our lives, that we might draw nearer to one another even as we draw nearer to you. I pray that the example of David would be a valuable lesson for us, not to allow our emotions to rule the day, but instead to pause and reflect. Lord, I just pray that we be blessed by the hearing of your word this day. I pray this in Jesus' name.